Good evening, everybody. This is the Enough to Keep Going podcast, episode number 29 for Tuesday, January 23rd. I was thinking it was going to say 29. Tonight, we have with us two other co-hosts who probably don't need to be named, but I'll name them anyways. We have one, Mr. Swissguard, who's looking very dapper today. He's got a tie on. I feel kind of underdressed.
It's Tie Tuesday.
Oh yeah, that's right. Forgot. I totally forgot. I was thinking it was Monday today for some reason. I don't know, even though I just said Tuesday. And of course.
No, and I'm cracking up because that is a callback to when Swiss and I used to work together. So
yeah, I still do it.
Slightly inside baseball, but
nice.
Me laughing.
They actually do that on my job too, which is I don't know. I was just gonna say I thought it was like some nationwide thing or something. And then we have Mr. Cleese Stamos, Mr. Social media guru himself. How's it going today?
Yeah, sure, it's fine.
Okay. Hey, as long as it's fine, it's not crappy. So good. All right, tonight's our discussion show. So we're gonna have actually we have a couple topics tonight. Usually we do kind of a quick playlist thing and then go into a topic, but Mr. Cleese switched it up a little, which is fine. That's cool. We're gonna have a couple topics here. The first one that we're gonna go over is from a podcast he listened to sometime this past weekend or week, and they brought up some points that I guess I don't know if it ruffled his feathers or not, or just something he wanted to talk about. So I don't know, Zeus, if he wanted to expand on that a little bit more. I should say.
Yeah, so it was definitely not a feather ruffling. Actually, I found the discussion really interesting. In fact, I measure my interest level in podcasts by whether or not I get so distracted that I do something on the road that is questionable, and I almost overtook a cop while I was listening to this podcast. So clearly, I was very immersed in the conversation. So there was a discussion on a podcast called Two Girls One Podcast earlier this week, and they were delving into the topic of game archaeology or gaming archaeology or archaeology in games. And they had a guest on the show, Mr. Andrew Reiner, who I initially jumped to the presumption that this was the editor-in-chief of Game Informer, who was also named Andy Reiner, I believe. But
he's moonlighting as an archaeologist, a gaming archaeologist,
right? But the topic he was actually discussing was. So I immediately found it interesting because in my field, in software engineering, there is a topic that we talk about called software archaeology. But this is a reference to when you are handed a piece of a legacy application or code that you didn't work on, and where like the people who worked on the app are no longer available or around. And we talk about this, and usually this is before a big project, and you're typically handed this application and told, hey, I need you to take over maintenance of this, do a major upgrade of this, or entirely modernize the thing, or even do a code rewrite. And so there's this period of research that we go through called software archaeology, where, and again, it's a reference to sometimes there's poor documentation, sometimes there's documentation that you don't intuitively get if you didn't work on the application. And so there's this period of software archaeology where we are pulling the legacy code apart and dumpster diving into the documentation to try and understand how the code is actually put together before we go in and do what I call open up the hood or make an incision and kind of start the open heart surgery on the code to start working on it.
Can I add one thing to that?
Yeah, go right ahead.
It's pretty much 100% of the case where the the engineers performing the archaeology are considering the engineers that wrote the original code idiots. So
that's generally the stance that a software engineer takes, particularly in their younger years. But
elegantly like there.
Right, because in Monday Morning Quarterbacker, we all tend to believe that we could have done a better job than the first crew, and we question every design choice that they made.
The fun stuff is when you're looking through old code and you're like, this guy was a moron, and then you realize you were the one that wrote the code like 2 years ago.
Yes, exactly. But the point is we call it software archaeology because, as Swiss mentioned, it's not just the technical aspect of pulling the code apart. There's a social aspect to it as well, because sometimes you're looking at the code and you're like, what was this guy thinking? And sometimes your interpretation of that is different if you knew the person, or sometimes if you knew what company the person worked for and you understand that culture, or if you don't. So at any rate, what Andrew Reiner was talking about was more about, he was specifically talking about No Man's Sky, where there was a extinction level event basically, and the developers kind of, I won't say wipe the slate clean, but they drastically changed the climate on every single planet in the universe. And in that event, a lot of structures and things that had been erected by players of the game up until that point were buried, were overcome by sand dunes or snow, and that
abandoned.
Yeah, or abandoned. And part of his research was, and specifically his point was that was done using procedural generation, and so it was done in an automated fashion. So the developers wrote the algorithm and hit the button that executed the change, but they didn't go in and individually hands-on make every single change, so they themselves don't know exactly all of the changes that were wrought throughout the universe. And his research topic for his doctorate was going around exploring that universe and evaluating what could be found, and kind of piecing together the mystery of how those things were put together or the events that surrounded them. Very interesting topic. There's a few small tidbits that came out of that conversation that, as it was going on and as I was listening to the podcast, my feeling was, wow, some of those are topics that we have directly discussed before on topics on our own show or shows in the past. And rather than, and I went back and forth with the hosts, and I'm probably going to butcher some of their names, Jen Jamula, Allison, I can't remember her last name right off the top of my head. Off the top of my head, because we were jammed trying to get in and get the live show going before, and Matt, who's their third co-host and producer, I believe. So there were a smaller number of topics or subtopics that, like I said, I went back and forth with them on Twitter, kind of commenting and sharing and talking it out, but there were some specific points I wanted to expand on, and I was like, I could write them a really long email, but it would be much more interesting if I got together with you guys, with the E2KG network crew, and kind of talk some of this stuff out, because I wanted to give them some feedback. One of the big dynamics of that episode was that Jen and Allison are not gamers, and so some of this content was new to them, or they had a different perspective or take on it, because as I said in the Twitter conversation, there are those of us inside the gaming bubble who see things through a certain lens or filter, and then there are people outside of that gaming bubble who don't, or see things differently. So I just wanted to kind of run through those maybe for the first 20 minutes of the show or so, and then we'll move. Prime, I think you set us up to then move on to our next topic.
Yes. So do you want to go through? Let's go through the why we game instead of reading or watching TV. How about that? Let's start with that one. And just real quick, the hosts are Allison Goldberg and Jennifer like you said, Jennifer Jamula, I guess that's how you say it. And produced and edited by Matt Silverman. Yeah. So Matt was in that conversation as well on Twitter. And I do remember their names. I don't want to disrespect them by saying I forgot their names. It's just I've done a ton of equipment and software set up to get the live stream going. And in the 10 or 15 minutes before we got started, I dumped that information trying to get everything else set up. So. Oh, no, it's all right. It happens. Information overload. So, yeah. So, see, when they're talking about this particular topic here, or this kind of bullet point, I don't think they really dive too much into it as far as, why do we game instead of reading and watch TV? We could do that a little bit more here, but for me at least, I kind of try to do all three. I guess. I guess the majority for me is obviously gaming. I do mostly gaming in my spare time. When I'm not doing stuff with my family or work or whatever. But lately I've been trying to do a kind of a balance of all three. I hadn't read a book or uh, anything substantial, magazine even for a long time, probably for almost a year maybe. So I've been trying to at least creep that back into my life a little bit, just doing some more reading, some light reading here and there, maybe a few times a week for like half hour, 45 minutes, an hour, maybe if I have the time. And TV is actually starting to go the wayside now. I'm pretty much behind in all my shows that I was watching before. So it's definitely a juggling act for me. And I guess why I game more is just kind of just the immersion. And I guess they kind of talked about this a little bit, maybe talking about the immersion in a little bit different subject, but it's just the immersion. It's more interactive. I can, my actions are directly, ported into the game. If I'm trying to hit somebody or jump or, just do anything in within the game, it's just a little more interactive, at least for me. How about you, Swiss? I know you watch TV. Do you do any reading? Do you try to do all three, kind of like me, or what's your situation?
I'm trying to do more reading. I've been kind of nursing a book for a while now, a couple of books. But I tend to do that and when I'm about to go to bed, so I read like 3 sentences and just like crash. So it's not I'm not very successful at it. Every now and then, as far as TV goes, basically it's NFL on Sundays, and then my wife and I might pick up a Netflix show. So we went through Stranger Things season 2 recently. But I don't watch much TV just because if it comes down to gaming versus TV, I only have time for one, and I choose gaming. So why do I do that? Kind of like you said, as far as the immersion, but I'm on reflecting on it. It's like, what makes entertaining TV entertaining, and it's that you form a connection. In a lot of movies, like take the original Star Wars Episode 4, right? Luke Skywalker is the vehicle that the audience can be drawn into the world. He's with him. He's kind of stuck on this backwater, and he dreams of doing more things and yada yada yada. So there's a connection there, and we can go with him on the hero's journey. With gaming, it's kind of like that immersion factor is like a force multiplier, because it's not just the fact that I can relate with the character in some way, shape, or form. My actions actually contribute to what happens. So for me, it's a more entertaining experience. And then, it's just, I don't like being passive. Sometimes you just sit there and watch TV and it's like, why am I watching this? And so it feels like when I'm gaming, even though it might be super casual and rather trite, I don't feel like my time is being as wasted, because I feel like I am more actively engaged, mentally with the activity.
Gasicles, how about you? You try to do one or the other, all three? Why do you game instead of the others?
So I definitely focus on gaming. You guys know me well, right, and know that I have this whole regimen of parsing out time, right? Because I feel like I have to, right? I've realized at a certain age that I couldn't cover the entire gamut of nerddom, cyclically, recursively every week, and so I have, just like I would have at work, right, or with a project or program that I'm managing, I have slices of time cut out, and then they're prioritized. I put my priority on gaming, and going back to when I was younger, before we necessarily got into podcasting and all that stuff. For me, I got asked this question a lot, right, by family and friends and blah blah blah, and sometimes I was challenged on the topic in relationships, right? I would have a companion or whatever who would say, well, I don't understand why you spend X amount of time gaming, and my response would be, well, I don't understand. Well, how much time do you spend watching TV at night, right? And sometimes those arguments would go in the direction of, look, I don't. You come home, you sit on the couch, you spend 2 or 3 hours watching TV. I come home, I get in front of my computer and I game for 2 hours, and then I move on to another task or thing. And for me, kind of like Swiss mentioned, right, a big thing for me that stuck with me throughout my life is that I had a high school teacher whose name I cannot remember now. Mr. Schwartz, and that one of that high school teacher's comments to me on one day in the middle of class was, Myers, you're the type of person who you need to burn all your brain cells out during the day, right? Otherwise, you're still going to be up thinking at night, and you're not going to get any sleep. I don't necessarily think that was true, but I guess I've always believed that I need to remain highly cognitively engaged during the day, and I don't get that out of reading or watching TV. Kind of like Swiss mentioned, it's an experience that's transmitted to you, and it's one channel, and you don't have the ability to really toggle that signal while you're experiencing it, and you're getting the view of the creator. Now there are some arguments, going on these days, especially these days in the topic of movies and how wrapped around the axle nerds get about, what The Last Jedi is saying or not saying, or what Batman versus Superman or Justice League is saying or not saying. But at any rate, there's a question of, are you supposed to consume those things, and are you supposed to interpret those things based on how the creator saw it, and is there a right answer? I personally believe that there's not. However, even with that content, that art that is not participatory, it's still modulated along one signal, right? There's only so much variation that you're going to get out of breaking it apart and decomposing it one way or the other. Gaming radically increases that variation. And of course, that's on a scale, right? Because we have games that there's only a certain degree, right? Only a certain swath of interpretation, but then we have games that are wide open for interpretation. And probably the last thing I'll say on it, as I think our listeners here, HEAR, not HERE, a couple times a month, and maybe arguably every episode, is, all four of us in different ways and on varying lengths, build a kind of imaginary narrative in our head that wraps the games that we're playing. It's not just the story that's being provided. And in fact, in a lot of cases, the games that don't have a story in them, like I talked about Rise of Nations last week, DBQ has talked about, when he plays Madden and when he plays baseball, we always have this, I'm going to use this name topically, content-wise, it's not the same, but we always have this additional 50 Shades of Grey kind of narrative that goes along with the game. And again, I don't mean that topically or by content, but my point is that, the racing game I'm playing is not just the racing game, right? It's the additional imagination that I add to it to flesh out my level of immersion that, this is me managing this Formula One team, right, in 2017, and the person I can't stand is that dude over there driving the Ferrari, right? Or as I mentioned in Rise of Nations, in my most recent skirmish, right, I added content to it via imagination to be able to discuss the differences between how I was managing my country versus how Napoleon was managing his across the way.
Right. I think the important distinction that you're in your comment there, when you're watching a movie, you're like, wow, Luke Skywalker's awesome. I want to be like Luke Skywalker. Or did you see what Luke Skywalker did? And you were just describing the game as, I did this, or I need to go against that dude over there. So even though when I'm playing Horizon Zero Dawn, it's Aloy, I still think about it as, I want to go over here and do that. I want to go over there and do that. And so there's more of a like a personal, not a personal connection, but I don't even know the word. You're not on the outside. You're you assume there's like a assuming the role. It's like a okay. Here's a throwback. What was that show? The Quantum Leap.
Right. Yeah.
Where you jump in. But
yeah, and the way I was going to phrase it, because you made me think about it, is it's what playing a game. I feel like there's a lot more clay to that material, right? The developer made a thing. How you participate it can radically change that vector of what it is. It's much more of a Schrodinger's box. When I open that game up, what it may become may be something significantly different than what the developer intended. Whereas when I'm reading a book or I'm watching a TV show or watching a movie, that's very much a thing in a transparent case, right? There is no box to open. It's very clear what that thing is. Now, I could walk around that prism and observe it from different facets and talk about it that way, but there is no box within which the cat is either dead or alive, right? That I feel like you kind of only get via gaming. So,
one last thing about this is there's a whole competition aspect that people that game can tap into. So I know our conversation has been focused a lot on maybe single player experiences to a certain extent, but that there is a social aspect, which I will probably get to in one of these bullet points. That's also appealing more so than just being able to talk around the water cooler about what the latest TV show was.
Yeah, there's very much three buckets. I think there's games as art, as interactive art. There's games as sport, or I struggle to use the term sport still in this day and age. Games as a competitive arena, and I can't remember what the third one is. So let's go on, Fred.
Okay, I was just gonna say, as far as these three go, I mean, I think books might be a little bit closer to gaming, just because you're reading a book. It's just a story. It's a linear story. That you're reading, but you're thinking in your mind. You have to imagine what's happening in the book. At least for me, that's how I do it. I'm thinking of, okay, here, this person's, like, say, Jurassic Park. When I was first reading that book, and yes, kids, that was a book before it was a movie. I'm reading the book, and I had this whole world that I dreamed up in my head as I'm reading the book, and the dinosaurs, how they looked, and how this and that, and the movie comes out, and it's like radically different, and obviously some people they kind of poo-poo on that and say, oh, this is not what I thought it was going to be. But yeah, okay, it's not what she thought it was going to be. This is the vision that the director had, and for at least this is how it's going to be. But what you're saying earlier, you kind of touched on it. And I'm going to kind of jump to the third point here real quick about talking to people outside that game. You mentioned, like, it might have done something with relationships, or how friends look at you, or maybe how family looks at you. And I know when I was younger, I was pretty embarrassed that, oh, hey, what's your hobby? Or like, oh, I do stuff, a game, maybe, I kind of felt embarrassed about it, I guess. Not so much with family, because all my family knew that, I played games. I always had people over, and, friends and stuff, that we played games, but, obviously people at work, or maybe family that I didn't see all the time, like aunts and uncles. But now that I got older, which I don't know, maybe it's kind of weird, but now I don't really care anymore. Like, I just say, hey, I game. That's what I do. That's my thing. So I don't know if it's just like an older thing that, you just don't care what people think anymore, but that's just how I see it now. I know some people, as they get older, they actually do kind of like, they kind of draw themselves in, they don't really want to admit that, hey, I'm 41, be 42 here in a couple weeks, and I'm still gaming. I don't care. I've been doing it all my life, so I'll keep doing it. So how do you guys cope, or how do you guys maybe cope with how people react to that, or how do you do you openly say, hey, I'm a gamer, or what's kind of the reaction that you guys have had in your life?
Well, I want to swing that just a little bit, because what and not that what you mentioned was not on point. It definitely is, but just to expand on it a little bit, one of the things I was trying to get to with this bullet was kind of that back and forth in that conversation that I had with the crew of the Two Girls One podcast show. one of the things that was great about their episode, here on this show, we want to get some more cast members on and increase the diversity of the different types of gamers, because within the gamer culture, there are different facets that people focus on, right? Like Swiss mentioned, there are some that focus on it as competitive. Then there are those who focus on it from a story aspect. But what was really interesting about their episode was you had Matt, who's inside the gamer bubble, right? Who participates in gaming, understands and operates within the gaming culture, and then you had Allie and Jen, who do not participate in that culture and had a different perspective. And so this question is, as you mentioned, Prime, is about so when we're having conversations, right? And we have conversations with different stripes of nerds, right? So we have friends that are the film nerds, we have friends that are the TV nerds, we have friends that are the tech nerds, and sometimes it catches me off guard, right? Because I go into a lot of those conversations assuming that everybody is a Renaissance nerd, right? That everybody gets all of the geek stuff, and that's not the case. And I don't get cosplay and LARPing and board games, right? Is a big thing. So one of the things, I thought it would be good for us to talk through, as you mentioned, Prime, is how do we talk to people inside and outside of the bubble? And it's hard. And one of the things I mentioned in the Twitter conversation is because there were a lot of questions from the hosts about trying to get around to, okay, so why should I care, and what's important to the rest of the world about this archaeological effort in games? And one of the things I mentioned, and I think Matt agreed with, was and maybe it's what people mean when they say mansplaining, which is a term I'm not fond of, but less about mansplaining and more about maybe from communicating inside a bubble, is making the assumption that, and Swiss knows I had mentioned this a lot at work, right? When I say, older, more senior engineers, I put a higher burden on them to prove what they're talking about, right? That just because you're a senior engineer, you've been around a long time, doesn't mean you get to just wave your hand and say that something is so, because that's the way you perceive it. No, all of us have a burden in conversation and discussion to kind of show our work, right? To prove what we claim through Socratic method or a logical argument or whatever that what we're saying has value. And I guess to answer your point, Prime, and maybe I guess I would say I've tried to do that in the past, but watching and listening to their conversation definitely highlighted it, and I'll make it more of a point that that in having those discussions and communicating to people outside the gaming bubble, whether we're talking about the financial impacts of it, or the risks that we go on talking about the business aspect or the legal aspects, that we've got to bridge that gap between those who are drinking that not drinking that oxygen, those who are breathing that atmosphere all the time versus those who don't. So yeah, I don't know, Swiss, you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, I guess I can just only speak to my experiences. For me, I never really thought of myself as like a quote unquote gamer when I was growing up. Like, I didn't feel like it was a thing that I should have that was stigmatized. It was just, that's what I did. I enjoyed N64 and my PS2, and I didn't really worry about it. It's been more recently, oddly enough, that I've encountered that, and I guess that's because I'm a quote unquote adult now, and it hasn't been from people my age. I think even if people at my age are outside the gaming bubble, they understand that it's a form of entertainment nowadays. And I guess it's just because they've grown up and they've had cousins and neighbors and friends that have had Nintendos and PlayStations, and it's not that big a deal. The big one for me was at my last job, the secretary. And she's basically old enough to be my mother. So that's the generation that she's from. And she would always be like, how did you stay up last night playing a video game? Or, she's like, what, she'd ask about what we're doing. And I was like, oh yeah, my wife and I did this, or played this game, or I played this game with my kids. And she never understood me being like, happy that my kids were playing games with me, or that my kids were playing games, or that I went out and bought a new game. She just couldn't get that it's like, her view is like, TV is entertainment, movies are entertainment, and games were just a thing that children do. And she hasn't like kind of lost that perspective on it. And as time went on, she could tell that it was more like, yeah, it is a form of entertainment, that an adult can enjoy different gameplay experiences than a child, and me as a father can make connections with my kids and have fun with them, and have a shared happy experience with my children through video games. And when I actually left, she got me a $30 GameStop gift card as a going away gift, which I flipped into Wolfenstein 2. So but it was more just like putting it in context as it's just another form of entertainment. And I never tried to say, well, it's superior to you just sitting there watching TV. It was just, a lot of it just came down to, well, you didn't grow up playing Nintendo, so it's going to be hard for you to understand, I guess.
Yeah. I was going to say, you kind of bring up what I was about to say is, in general, people, when they're kind of coming down on gamers or whatever, just kind of like they don't understand, it's like, hey, why, how can you sit there and, play games for hours, and, you're just wasting your life. But, you turn it around, I'm like, well, I mean, you just binge watched, Stranger Things for, 2-3 days. I mean, how's that any different? It's something that we enjoy to do, it's it's our entertainment. And obviously we watch TV, we do other things too, but I mean, I don't see why it's any different than, sitting watching TV or movies, going to a movie like every day or every weekend or whatever. So
I want to wrap that back to what we were saying earlier, and then I'll push through the third billet because Prime wants us to move on. But the difference to me is the learning, right? Is the engagement. I understand the physics of how an automobile works, because I had to dig into it when I first started playing Gran Turismo, right? Understanding what camber and toe in and toe out are, and understanding the forces of physics that take place when a certain amount of surface area of a car's tire are in contact with the ground. I learned that from playing Gran Turismo, right? And believe it or not, that feeds into how I drive and how I learn to drive, right? Understanding those physical dynamics helped a great deal. When I'm playing Rise of Nations, just like I was playing this week, right? I was playing the Bantu versus the French, and their leader was Napoleon. I had no idea who the Bantu were, right? So I spent 10 or 15 minutes going off and diving in to Wikipedia and other sites that had historical content, understanding that. Same thing back in the day when I played Civilization. So I think there's a lot of really kind of social systems engineering that takes place when you play a game, and because a game is a system of systems. Each dynamic, each component, each player, object, whatever, on a field or in a space or in an environment operates a certain way. And when you're playing a game, you're trying to grasp a total understanding of how all of those things, the characteristics of each of those individual components, but also how they all interact together, their failure modes and all that sort of thing. So the last bullet in this, because we've definitely, unfortunately, I apologize, we've gone a bit longer than we wanted to, but the second bullet was what the value of the rest of society can be had from this archaeological effort that Andrew Reiner mentioned. And one of the things I wanted to point out was, he talked a lot about how during this extinction level event, the center of the galaxy, the hub, was evacuated and abandoned, and players left messages for people and so on and so forth. And there was a question about, what value is there of observing all that? So I just want to point out that in addition to what Andrew Reiner is doing, there's lots of research that have gone on from sociologists looking at mass events that have happened in games, things that have happened in Warcraft, things that have happened on EVE Online. Because the reality is there is a good chance that when something big and bad happens, that actual human beings are going to behave in similar ways. And there are efforts going on to take those events and the human behavior that surrounds them and decompose them and build models to talk about, okay, when hundreds of thousands of people need to evacuate from an area, what's the likelihood that these are the ways they're going to behave? What happens when there are tons of humans in an encapsulated space and resources are scarce? So that's worked its way into a lot of our fiction, right? So the Walking Dead, things like that. We are seeing examples of how we believe and predict people are going to behave if a real catastrophe or a crisis actually happens. And I think there's value to that in helping FEMA prepare and helping other emergency organizations prepare to respond to those. So.
Right. I think the problem is that it's because it's a video game. The term game immediately conjures up, play and, entertainment and fun. But really what it is you're using the game as a simulator. And when you use the term simulation or computational model, suddenly it's scientific. So it's more just that I think the real story is that games have advanced enough to become viable simulators, is what it boils down to. You can leverage them that way rather than just having a computational model that is going to try to predict when the next thunderstorm's coming or something. It's all programming in ones and zeros, but it's cool that, like you said, a system of systems can be advanced enough to be utilized in that manner.
Yeah, so I just want to wrap up by saying thanks a lot to the Two Girls One podcast show. It was very entertaining observing your content. But Prime, let's do our own damn show.
All right, let's go to. Well, I mean, it was still timely. It's still on track with games and such. So, but yeah, our next topic here is when franchises have kind of lain dormant maybe for 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 years or so, and then they someone decides to reboot them or even or just relaunch them into the modern era, and we have a whole list of games here, but I'm just going to pick one that that's kind of that I've played and then in the past, and I know it has come back, and that's Tomb Raider. So back in 2013, they rebooted it, relaunched it. Basically, it's kind of I guess it would be a prequel to the old games, the PS1 game when it came out. I'm not even really sure if it was if they tracked the timeline, at all, if that's if everything lines up. But they relaunched it into the modern era. Lara Croft is she's just starting out basically on her Tomb Raider adventures. There's this whole, it's not just, running around the jungle, going to tombs, shooting dinosaurs like in the first game, which was kind of weird. But, they make her, actually a deeper character. She has this whole storyline. I know it's an old game, but I don't want to spoil it. But, it's her, kind of her, I guess, awakening into the Tomb Raider, into her role, as I guess we're going to call it heroine or hero. It was interesting because I did play, I did play at least the first game, and I know I beat that one. And I might have played the second one, and there was maybe 3 or 4 more after that, maybe if I remember correctly, maybe even 5. I guess there's some Xbox titles or PSN Live, kind of smaller titles that came out too. But the main core Tomb Raider game was kind of dormant for oh man, I'm not even sure, like 5 or 6 years maybe before they had done anything, from 2013. And it was just amazing, how they fleshed this character out and how I cared about the character again. It wasn't just a sex symbol, character. It was actually, she had feelings. She lost people. She was looking for people, during this adventure, during this game. So it was really interesting how I did, start caring about this character again in a different way. It was just action, and exploring. It was, seeing how, she did get beat up a lot in the game, but it was just interesting to see how the character grew and how they fleshed out the character. So I don't do these, when these games kind of go away and come back, do you care, or does it matter? Does it kind of, I shouldn't say better, but does it depend on, which game it is? Like for Tomb Raider, obviously I had a connection to it, in the past, and came back and I was into it. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to play the second one, but I'll probably eventually do it eventually. But does it matter, in general, if these games come back at all?
I think I'm going to take the cop out and say it depends.
There we go. That's why I threw that in there.
But like with Tomb Raider, it came back. It was in the hands of a quality developer. I'm pretty sure Square Enix did it.
Square has been the publisher.
Okay.
But the actual dev studios were Core Designs and then Crystal Dynamics.
Okay. Well, I mean, the fact that it was rebooted, I didn't play the originals, and the fact that they brought it back and kind of revamped it's kind of given me another entry point, and it's one of those games that is on my list of when I want to pick up a used game. So, I'm excited about that. There are another example of that dynamic of there's a fresh entry point. You don't feel like you're getting in late type dynamic is the Metroid series. So I had never played, the original Metroid or anything like that on the Game Boy or NES or Super NES. The most experience I had with Samus was basically from Super Smash Brothers. So when Metroid Prime came out on the GameCube, I picked it up and I know it was a very different reimagining of it's taking a 2D platformer type game, action game into more of a 3D into 3D, but I really appreciated that, and I was I enjoyed Metroid Prime and Metroid Prime 2, and it was a great way for me to kind of get into the Metroid universe. But on the other hand, I think it depends on how sincere the gesture is by the developers. Let's put it that way. Sincerity. Is it a cash grab? Would be the question. So one thing I mentioned in our offline in our chat client was the Metal Gear franchise, and it hasn't been gone that long, but they're bringing it back. Konami is bringing it back, but Kojima has left to found his own studio after some acrimony, and so they divorced. And I absolutely love Metal Gear Solid, and the fact that they're bringing back Metal Gear Survive or whatever, and trying to revamp the franchise, it just feels like they're trying to capitalize on the name, and that's disappointing. So in that case, I'm not excited about it. So it really depends. Is it a quality game? If it's a quality game that can tap into someone's nostalgia, then great.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And most of the point of this question was poised around kind of how we feel in the lead up, right, to the release. It's when the thing gets announced and the thing is coming back, do we care and do we pay attention to it in the walk up? Because unfortunately, in a lot of cases, maybe I might argue most cases, if we don't participate in or hook into the buzz in the walk up, then those tend to be games that we don't pay any attention to until they drop on Xbox, Games for Gold or PlayStation Plus or whatever. So yeah, but Swiss, you brought up, because I've been struggling to figure out an answer to this myself. But you brought up an interesting point: is the developer treating it like something sacred, like they need to do well with it, like it's not a, I hate to use this term because of the last conversation we had, but it's not a game to them, right? But they're treating it with a degree of sincerity and care for the character, which is kind of a thing that you kind of get in comic books. Is probably the closest analog I can think of is when a a creative team who hasn't been given a big character is handed a big character for the first time, right? And all the angst and anguish, they may choose to go off in a different direction, but what people tune into is whether or not they're doing it with care, or is it more of like a Michael Bay kind of thing, where they're just trying to radically make big explosions and they don't really care about the legacy of the property.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like for Metal Gear, like you mentioned, you know, I played the first one, you know, back in '98. Uh, Amazingly, I don't know how, but I actually beat it because I wasn't into stealth games, and I think that's what kind of threw me off of stealth games. It was just like it was just too much sneaking around. I just couldn't take it anymore. But you know, coming back with Survive, for me, it's like, all right, that's fine, I guess. I mean, because I'm just not, you know, invested in that game anymore. You know, it just kind of, you know, went off my radar. And kind of in the same vein, I know, you know, like you. I don't want to say like you. I don't know if you're gonna try it out or not. Survive. And this happens to a lot of games where they try to do something different with it. And I know Kojima's gone, so obviously maybe you know they wanted to try something different, or maybe they had to just because they didn't have maybe the staff now to do a Metal Gear like, you know, Kojima would, just kind of, you know, out there fantastical, you know, game that they do. But you know, sometimes they try to do something different and it just gets, you know, just, you know, crapped on and just beat down before the game even comes out. Now I haven't seen anything in Metal Gear Survive. I think there was a beta or there's one coming up. But you know, I just kind of hate that generalization that, oh, you know, it's not, you know, it's not Kojima, it's not or whoever, you know, it can be any game. You know, it's not the original creator, so you know it's going to be bad, or you know, it's not, you know, a stealth game, so it's going to be horrible. So I think it kind of stinks sometimes, and yeah, sometimes that is, you know, the reason, you know, the doing it is just a cash grab. But you got to give it a chance sometimes.
Right. I guess with the example of Metal Gear, you know, I've read a little bit about Metal Gear Survive. I don't. You're right. I can't make a good judgment call on it yet. But for me, with Metal Gear Solid, Kojima was so quirky, and he put so much of that in the games. You know, just the first battle when I fought Psycho Mantis, and I think I can have a spoiler from a game from '98. But
sure, why not?
You know, I'm playing you're playing the boss, and he's like, I can predict every move you make, and they have you switch the controller from port 1 to port 2 in the PlayStation, and then Psycho Mantis is like, oh, I can't read your mind anymore, and then you can beat him. And it's just a lot of little things that I absolutely love. And for me, like, it's hard, like, that's what Metal Gear is. And perhaps it's just that I'm, like you said, you played it, and so it's not that big a deal. I'm too close to the franchise. What's another good example?
Ninja Gaiden.
I don't.
Maybe there's another one I can think
See,
of.
I haven't played that,
See,
so
there you go.
Yeah. It's.
So there's an example of where,
yeah,
you know, the main person left, and you know, the next game in the series that did try to do it, you know, as he would have done it, and it just didn't work out. So you know, it kind of, once again, it kind of depends on, you know, what's going on.
But I think it comes to that level of care. If you try to change it too much, are you just trying to add a new perspective on it, or are you misunderstanding what made it great in the first place? And Valkyria Chronicles is another. It hasn't been gone that long. They announced Valkyria Chronicles 4, but they had that Valkyria Revolution where they completely changed the gameplay and everything, and everybody crapped on it, like you said. And it was because they changed what the game was. It was no longer like a strategy type game. They made it some action game. So,
and on that point, I think one of the things I'm coming around to as I hear you guys talk about it, right, is I think the reality is a lot of times we don't, in that, you know, we've had a different discussion topic before where we've talked about, you know, when a dev takes a game and inherently changes the nature of what it was, right? That we tend not to care as much, and I should say don't care. Some people care a lot because they large vocal outcry about the developer twisting around their thing. But I think we aren't as interested in it. And it's because there are a few gamers, and there are some gamers who definitely like living in a world, right? There are people who are invested in the world of Halo, and if you give them an RTS, a first-person shooter, a grand strategy game, and a flight sim, they would be pleased as punch, right? As long as it was all about Halo and being in that world. I guess the gamers I know and the type of gamer I am, I'm not as much we're not as much invested in the world as far as the games go. Now, if you give us a movie or a short action film or something like that, that could be whatever, right? And we do like that content. But as far as the game, what we fell in love with was that game, not necessarily. I mean, we fell in love with that game first. Maybe we later got into the world, but my point is that you know, when these games come out that are an inherently different genre, I am not as much into them. I dedicatedly played Halo 1, 2, and 3. We're spending time still in multiplayer, and I'm very vested in participating in those games in first-person shooters. As first-person shooters, I have Halo Wars 1 and 2, but I'm not dumpster diving into them and spending a lot of time, right? That's not what I fell in love with. And quite honest, now that I have to line that up against RTSs, they don't stack up against my favorite RTSs, right? My favorite RTSs are my favorite RTSs, regardless of what world or content they're in. And I think maybe this is the reason, you know, Blizzard backed off of doing a StarCraft first-person shooter, right? Because there might be people who are in love with that world, but I think those people are a niche for each given kind of franchise, and your sales numbers are likely to not be very impressive.
So you wouldn't play a Rise of Nations shooter?
I don't know.
Maybe it's not a shooter because I don't know. I don't think it really works that way.
No, but I mean, you know, there were these hybridized kind of RTSs where they focused on hero characters and you could zoom in, and like fight as the character, and those didn't stick around, you know, from a popularity standpoint. I guess what I'm saying is that I only care about them when they line up as great genre games. I'm not gonna play a Rise of Nations shooter just because it's just because it's the Rise of Nations branding, and it's associated with that world, right? What I've fallen in love with is Rise of Nations as an RTS, and extending that into a different genre doesn't necessarily make me care about it, even if Rise of Nations went away 10 years ago and now they're bringing it back, right? And same thing, right? Most people with the whole XCOM thing were not, and I don't even did the squad based like tactical shooter thing even ever come out, or did that get canceled and they only did like the squad based top down thing?
I think it did come out. I think it was called Declassified or something like that, I believe. You might want to check on that real quick. But another example of totally changing on genre was Shadowrun on the 360 and PC, because it was crossplay. You know, Shadowrun originally was like an RPG game, but then they turned it into a shooter basically. You know, it was only online, which was kind of weird for 360. It's like the first online only shooter that they had. So, you know, and everybody like jumped all over that just because, you know, oh, why is this a shooter? This can't be a shooter. But, you know, when I never played the RPG or, you know, whatever it was back in the past. I played the shooter and I loved the game. It was interesting. It was kind of like with Red Faction Guerrilla, where the multiplayer was something different from, you know, in that time period. Now you could probably see elements of both of those games in all kinds of games, but you know, nowadays. But back then it was, you know, something different. You know, you can teleport through walls, and you know, obviously you can do that in Destiny now. You know, you can fly around or glide around a little bit, and you know, you do all these different things. And it was for me, and maybe on, you know, this was on console, but maybe on PC they had games like this. But you know, for me, it was something different, and you know, I loved the game. But you know, everybody was, you know, lambasting it, you know, for what it was at the time. So it's just interesting how these games play out. And then just kind of I guess a secondary question. This is actually from, I guess DB was gonna bring this up, and I'm sorry I forgot to mention this, but he, you know, Swiss came on, you know, in the last minute for DB. He had some things to take care of, but hopefully everything goes okay with him. He was wondering, do you think developers and, you know, publishers kind of hold back these franchises on purpose, or is it just I guess you know, kind of to add on to that question is, you know, do these publishers just, you know, pound these games out so often, and maybe this was more on a 360, maybe not so much now because they're starting to back off, but you know, that they're pounding these franchises, you know, out so often and so hard that, you know, people just were like, you know what, I don't, you know, these come out every year, so I'm not going to play this year. You know, obviously, you know, sales start to figure into these start to figure into that. So is that part of it too, or how do you think that plays out?
Well, before we hit that up, I just want to bring up what I fact checked while you were talking. So so it was XCOM Declassified, done by 2K Games, I think spearheaded by Irrational Studios, but there may have been, I think this was when they were renamed to 2K Marin. Came out in 2013, not received well. So overall scores down in the in the 60s, somewhere between 61.9 and like 68. So yeah, not received
well. To answer your question, do they intentionally leave these games, kind of abandon the games? I find it hard to think that they would strategically say, if this is going to make money for us, we should wait for 4 years or 5 years or whatever and put it on ice, so to speak. I think they're going to want to push it if they can. I just think that they could see metrics saying, hey, there might be some audience fatigue here, and we're not going to get a return on our investment if we pump out another Age of Empires. So, like, for me, we're about to get some new Age of Empires remasters and Age of Empires 4. And that's exciting for me because I have an emotional connection to the original Age of Empires and Age of Empires 2. That was those were the RTSs that my brother and I played a lot of together. But I think Age of Empires 3 wasn't so great. And, Age of Mythology, they kind of tried to take a different tact, and I don't know how well it really took off. I mean, I guess it did okay. But Ensemble Studios closed because Age of Empires was not, the momentum had slowed down. And I think if a publisher sees the momentum slowing down, they're going to react accordingly. And how many Prince of Persia games did we get in the early 2000s? And eventually it's like, okay, you guys have exhausted your you've exhausted your creativity here. I don't need some super dark, angry emo version of the Prince or whatever. It's just, let's take a break. If there was a new Prince of Persia, there might be. I don't know. If there was, I'd be interested in it because I enjoyed Sands of Time. But, I think you pretty much nailed it. It's like if there's going to be money to be made, I think they'd go for it. So.
Yeah, but it seems like they don't hit that realization point until they see one of their own releases fail, or another publisher's fail, and then they pull the plug on it, right? Like none of them got ahead of or saw that like instrument-based party games were going to eventually implode until they saw one of their releases fail and the sales numbers dip. And to answer your question, I think we got about it wasn't the 90s, it was the aughts, the early 2000s. Then we got like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about 8, 9, 10, about 10 Prince of Persia games.
Wow, that's more than I even imagined.
Right. One of those, admittedly, was a remake of the classic, a re-release of the classic Prince of Persia, and one of them was probably like an RTS or something, Battles of Prince of Persia. That was the Nintendo 3DS one. So, core Prince of Persia, probably about 10, it looks like, or 8 rather. But yeah, it seems like they eventually. I think Prime. I think you're both kind of right. I think with what Sis was saying, they see when one fails, and they tend to not. In this day and age, they don't continue to bang their head against the wall, right? So, I think what we don't see a lot of is we don't see, hey, this iteration failed, let's give you another chance next year, right? We're seeing this iteration failed, your studio is closed, pack up all your stuff, and move to Montreal, right, or whatever.
Yeah, Mass Effect.
Mass Effect. Yeah, I was saying.
That's what I was thinking.
Right. And as I continue to say, not just Mass Effect, right, but all those Sony studios that did first-party games in the PlayStation 3 era that didn't get the sales numbers that Sony was looking for, right? So there's that. But I do think that there's a little bit of kind of a, pop star, music star kind of management approach where somebody says, hey, hey, Laura Croft, you're just not the hot thing anymore. Let's you need to, this happens to all pop stars, right? You need to take a 5-year break, and then we'll bring you back, right? When your genre is the new hotness, see that new pop star over there. That's what everybody's looking for. So some manner of that in combination with the, hey, we've done Halo 3 times. We really don't want to do more. We'd really like to do something else. You can continue it if you want, but hand it over to this team and let us do, something else. And I think some of those, in addition to the whole, when things descend into IP hell, licensing hell, is where you get like the 5-year gaps before a franchise comes back, or the 10-year gaps, or somebody who was the father or the mother of a given thing. It just says, yeah, I'm done with that, and it doesn't get picked up until some other creative genius comes along and says, hey, I want to pick that thing up and like recreate it.
Yeah, and there were some interesting games that you guys had on here. Fable, which obviously just was announced that Playground Games is gonna more than likely, I think it's still a leak. I don't know if it's been official or not. I can't remember, but they're going to be doing the Fable remake or reboot or whatever it is. And they're the Forza Horizon people, right? Developers or publishers, developers.
Forza Horizon, yeah.
Horizon, yeah. So I think that's in a separate group too that's going to be doing that game. So I know they had mentioned that a few months ago that they were working on some kind of action game, or something that's not racing, basically. Age of Empires at Swiss had mentioned Mutant Football League, which a spiritual successor to Mutant League Football back in the day, back in the Genesis, I think it was. Might have been, yeah, I think it was the Genesis, which actually I was just playing a little bit before the podcast, or at least the trial of it. So, yeah, it was pretty much like the Genesis one, but 3D graphics. You had mentioned Max Payne. I'm not sure why you had brought that one back. I guess.
Well, because Max Payne 1 and 2 were a very specific thing that were all wrapped around like the bullet time effect and the John Woo. That was the big marketing thing. It was like playing in a John Woo film. But then there was a big gap. I think Max Payne 2 was maybe 2003, 2004 at most. Yeah. And then there was like 8 years before Max Payne 3, and when he resurfaced, he was an inherently different thing. And the game was an inherently different thing. So for me, I was a diehard, like that was one of like the first demo or pre-release games that I played that I cared enough about that I wanted to play it before release. And same thing about Max Payne 2, but like I didn't care a blip about Max Payne 3.
Wow.
Because it was just it was a completely redesign of the game and not the thing that I'd fallen in love with.
Yeah. Yeah, that was probably, well, I don't want to get too much into it, but, obviously Max Payne was, bullet time and, action stuff. So, it was a game of the times, basically. And I think Max Payne, the 3 was too, but, it was a different time and something we didn't really want to, get into. I was kind of the same way. I wasn't really excited when it was announced. I was just like, oh, okay. Plus, I don't think it was the same developers that was doing Max Payne 3, if I remember correctly. I thought it was a different developer. But I'll let you fact check that real quick. But yeah, I mean, I think just to finish this off, just like I had mentioned at the beginning, it just kind of depends on what your relationship with the game is that's coming back, whether you care or not. So, any last words before we wrap up here, gentlemen? Any games here that you're looking forward to of a reboot?
So the only one thing I wanted to say is I wanted to go back and mention one thing about the conversation we started the show with, in that whole topic of how do we talk to people inside and outside the gaming bubble. One of the things I wanted to mention, because we'll bringing it back up, is so I'm getting a chance to do an experiment and practice this thing exactly, because I recently bought my daughter's original Atari Pong set, and so I'm having conversations with them, and they don't live in that bubble, right? Gaming is a new thing to them, and what I'm going to be trying to do is like every year buying them the next generation console that came after that. So eventually they kind of hyper accelerate, 1 year at a time, whereas those console generations were 4 to 8 years at a time, and get them to a point where they're on a modern console, but they're going to experience that history. And so having that contact, those conversations on an anachronistic piece of gear, in a different time, and walking them up to modern day is going to be that exact conversation, right? I live in the bubble, they don't, and as they cross the membrane into the bubble, they're still coming into it from a different vector than I did. So should be interesting.
Yeah, actually thought about doing that with my son, but it just didn't go well. It just didn't happen because he got his hands on iPads and phones and stuff, and it was just too late by the time I wanted to get to him. So, but it was fine. I mean, we go back now and play the older games. Like I said, I think I mentioned last week about we play the SNES Classic. So, and hopefully when the NES Classic comes out again, which I think is supposed to be re-released this year, I can get that and we can jump back into that too. So, Swiss, any last words before we head out tonight?
If you're going to reboot a franchise, understand why it's a franchise in the first place.
Nice. All right, gentlemen.
I'll peg my fact check onto that. So Max Payne was made by a different studio, but all still within the family. So Remedy, who is a Rockstar studio, did Max Payne 1 and 2. Max Payne 3 was done by Rockstar Studios, still owned by the same publisher.
Okay. Cool. All right, gentlemen, that'll be it for episode 29 of Enough to Keep Going. Excuse me. Come back on this Thursday, where we will do our news show, E2KG in 30, the fastest gaming news on the internet. I believe we are going to be an hour earlier than usual. Same time, 9:15 Eastern. Yep.
Ish. Yep.
Yeah. And then, do you guys still doing the entertainment show? I haven't seen anything recently that I saw.
We do. We just wrapped Correction X because The Gifted ended its season 1. So we do. As of right now, we're talking about whether or not we do something to bridge the time between Correction X and Jessica Jones season 2 dropping in March. We might do that in February. Otherwise, we will be back in March to do Jessica Jones 2.
Okay, cool. And then head back here next Tuesday for another episode of Enough to Keep Going, where I believe we will be going through our playlists, a little deeper dive into our playlists, and we will find out if Agastocles, how he's doing in Hind, I believe is what we had picked for you.
Yeah, Air Missions Hind.
Yeah.
On PC.
So we'll see. We'll see how that's going. So for Swissguard and Agastocles Stamos, I am Osiris Prime. We will see you next time.